What if I told you that buried within the depths of a Chinese prison cell, while enduring 20 years of unimaginable suffering, one man discovered a spiritual secret so profound that it literally transformed his ability to access divine power? Watchman Nee, in those final decades of his earthly journey, wasn't just surviving persecution. He was unlocking a mystical code that 99% of believers will never even glimpse, let alone understand. This wasn't theology learned from books or seminaries. This was revelation forged in the crucible of absolute surrender, where human strength dies and something infinitely greater is born. The religious establishment doesn't want you to know what Nee discovered, because it threatens everything they've built their empires upon. While they teach you to beg and plead with heaven, Nee found the hidden key that transforms prayer from desperate petition into authoritative command. He understood that most Christians live their entire lives operating from the outer court of spiritual experience, never realizing that the Holy of Holies, that sacred inner chamber where God's presence dwells unfiltered, has been accessible all along. But accessing it requires dying to everything you think you know about spiritual power, everything your religious leaders have told you about how God works, and everything your mind insists must be true. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal the exact spiritual mechanism that Nee called the secret of the cross. Not the cross as a religious symbol, but as the ultimate technology for accessing divine authority. This isn't about positive thinking or manifestation techniques. This is about understanding how the spiritual realm actually operates and why your prayers either move mountains or bounce off heaven's ceiling. What you're about to discover will either revolutionize your entire relationship with the divine, or you'll dismiss it and return to the powerless religious routine that keeps you spiritually bankrupt. The choice, as Nee learned in that cold prison cell, is entirely yours. The prison guards thought they had broken Watchman Nee when they threw him into that concrete cell in 1952, but they had unknowingly created the perfect laboratory for spiritual discovery. While his body weakened and his earthly ministry seemed to crumble, Nee was experiencing something that would have terrified his captors if they had understood its true implications. In the suffocating darkness of solitary confinement, he began to perceive what he later described as the divine mathematics, a precise spiritual equation that governs how heavenly power flows into earthly reality. This wasn't mystical speculation. This was hard-won knowledge extracted from the depths of human suffering and divine encounter. Most believers spend their entire lives trying to climb up to God through religious performance, unaware that the entire premise is backwards. Nee discovered that heaven's power doesn't flow to those who strive upward, but to those who descend downward into what he called the fellowship of his sufferings. The cross, he realized, wasn't just a historical event or a theological concept. It was the permanent doorway between two realms, always open, always accessible, but requiring a specific key to unlock its mysteries. That key wasn't faith as most people understand it, but something far more radical and terrifying to the human ego. In those prison walls, stripped of everything that had defined his identity and ministry, Nee encountered what ancient mystics called the dark night of the soul, but what he recognized as the necessary passage into authentic spiritual authority. He understood that God's power cannot coexist with human self-reliance, that divine strength only manifests where human strength has been completely exhausted. This wasn't a punishment or a test. It was the natural law of spiritual physics, as immutable as gravity, as predictable as the sunrise. The religious establishment teaches people to avoid this process, to seek comfort and blessing, never realizing they're running from the very thing that would transform them into vessels of supernatural power. The revelation that changed everything came to him not through prayer or study, but through the complete collapse of his ability to maintain any spiritual facade. When he could no longer pretend to be strong, when every religious mask had been stripped away, when he had nothing left to offer God but his absolute brokenness, that's when he discovered what he called the secret place of the Most High. This wasn't a location but a spiritual position, not a destination but a way of being that turns ordinary humans into conduits of extraordinary power. And the terrifying truth he uncovered was that 99% of believers will do anything to avoid this place, preferring the safety of religious routine to the dangerous intimacy of divine union. The code Nee discovered operates on what he termed the principle of spiritual displacement, a law as rigid and unbreakable as any physical principle, yet invisible to those who operate purely from the natural mind. He observed that divine power fills only the spaces that human power has completely vacated, not partially or temporarily, but permanently and irrevocably. This meant that accessing heaven's authority required something far more radical than momentary surrender or periodic submission. It demanded what he called the perpetual crucifixion of self, a continuous dying that allows continuous divine life to flow through the vessel. Traditional Christianity teaches people to invite God into their lives, but Nee understood this was fundamentally flawed thinking. The correct spiritual technology involves not inviting God in, but removing everything that blocks his presence from manifesting. He compared it to light filling a room. The light doesn't need to be invited. It simply fills every space not occupied by darkness. Similarly, divine power naturally fills every space not occupied by human willfulness, human understanding, human strength, or human agenda. The prison experience had shown him that God wasn't distant and needed to be persuaded to act. God was closer than his own breath and merely waiting for the obstacles to be removed. The breakthrough came when Nee realized that most spiritual struggle occurs because believers are trying to add God to their existing life structure rather than allowing God to become their life structure. They want divine power to enhance their human abilities rather than replace them entirely. This creates what he called spiritual static, an interference pattern that blocks the clear transmission of heavenly authority. In the silence of his cell, with all human props removed, he experienced what happened when the static disappeared completely. The result wasn't just peace or comfort. It was access to a dimension of spiritual authority that operated through weakness rather than strength, through surrender rather than effort. What Nee discovered in that prison laboratory challenges everything the modern church teaches about spiritual power. He found that the believers who experience the most dramatic supernatural breakthroughs aren't the strongest or most faithful, but those who have learned to maintain what he called the posture of spiritual death. They've discovered how to live from a place of permanent internal surrender, where their will has become so aligned with divine will that distinguishing between the two becomes impossible. This isn't passivity or resignation. It's the most dynamic spiritual state imaginable, where human personality becomes the perfect conductor of divine electricity, allowing heaven's power to flow into earth with no resistance whatsoever. The prison years revealed to Nee that there exists what he privately called the hidden curriculum of the kingdom, a series of spiritual lessons that can only be learned through experiences that completely shatter human self-reliance. While religious education focuses on accumulating knowledge about God, this hidden curriculum involves the systematic dismantling of everything that stands between the believer and direct divine experience. It's not taught in seminaries or churches because it can't be taught through words or concepts. It can only be lived through circumstances that strip away every false foundation until only the eternal remains. Nee began to understand that God doesn't send suffering as punishment, but as invitation, an invitation to discover dimensions of divine intimacy that are impossible to access while human resources remain available. He observed that every great spiritual breakthrough in history occurred not when believers were strong and confident, but when they had been reduced to absolute dependence on divine intervention. The pattern was so consistent that he began to view difficulty not as obstacle, but as opportunity, not as problem, but as doorway to deeper spiritual authority. The secret code he uncovered operates through what he termed the exchange principle, a spiritual transaction where human limitation is traded for divine capability, human understanding for divine wisdom, human strength for divine power. But this exchange can't be forced or manufactured through religious techniques. It only occurs in those moments of genuine spiritual bankruptcy, when the believer stops trying to contribute anything to their relationship with God and learns to receive everything as pure grace. These moments can't be scheduled or manipulated. They arise naturally when life circumstances create the necessary spiritual pressure. Most believers never discover this code because they're taught to view their weaknesses as obstacles to overcome rather than doorways to enter. They spend their spiritual energy trying to become stronger, more faithful, more knowledgeable, never realizing that God's power flows most freely through admitted inadequacy. Nee learned that the phrase, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness," wasn't consolation for those who couldn't achieve spiritual strength. It was the fundamental operating principle of the kingdom of heaven. The believers who unlock supernatural authority aren't those who have conquered their limitations, but those who have learned to partner with God through their limitations. During his imprisonment, Nee experienced what he later described as the inversion of spiritual logic, a complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about how divine power operates in human experience. He discovered that heaven's authority flows not through impressive spiritual performance, but through what appears to be spiritual failure, not through religious success, but through the kind of brokenness that religious systems are designed to avoid. This inversion was so complete and counterintuitive that it took him years to fully understand its implications. The code revealed itself most clearly in moments when Nee had exhausted every human resource and could contribute nothing to his own survival or spiritual state. In these moments of complete helplessness, he began to notice that divine intervention would manifest with a precision and power that his years of active ministry had never produced. It was as if God had been waiting for these moments of absolute human incapacity to demonstrate what was possible when divine power encountered no human interference. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant supernatural authority was far more accessible than he had imagined. Terrifying because it required the death of everything he had built his identity upon. He began to understand that what most believers call spiritual warfare is actually internal resistance to this process of divine displacement. The real battle isn't against external enemies, but against the human ego's insistence on maintaining some measure of spiritual self-sufficiency. Every attempt to help God, to contribute to his work, to maintain some level of spiritual competence, actually blocks the very power it seeks to access. The prison experience stripped away his ability to engage in this resistance, creating the perfect conditions for him to discover what happens when human effort is completely removed from spiritual equation. The most shocking revelation was that this spiritual technology had been hidden in plain sight throughout Scripture, embedded in every story of divine intervention, present in every account of supernatural breakthrough. But religious interpretation had obscured the pattern by focusing on the external circumstances rather than the internal spiritual position of those who experienced God's power. Nee realized that every patriarch, prophet, and apostle had accessed divine authority through the same principle, the complete abandonment of human resources in favor of exclusive dependence on divine intervention. The code wasn't new revelation, but the recovery of something that had been systematically edited out of popular spiritual teaching because it threatened established religious hierarchies. In the final years of his imprisonment, Nee experienced what he privately called the convergence, a state of spiritual consciousness where the boundaries between human will and divine will became so permeable that he could no longer distinguish where his desires ended and God's purposes began. This wasn't mystical confusion, but practical spiritual mechanics, the natural result of prolonged internal surrender that had rewired his entire approach to prayer, decision-making, and spiritual authority. He had become what he termed a living prayer, a human being whose existence had become so aligned with divine intention that his very presence catalyzed supernatural breakthrough. The code he had discovered wasn't just theoretical knowledge, but practical spiritual technology that could be applied by any believer willing to embrace the necessary internal death. However, he also understood why so few would ever access it, because it requires abandoning every form of spiritual security that religious systems provide. It demands trading the safety of spiritual performance for the vulnerability of divine dependence, exchanging the predictability of religious routine for the dangerous intimacy of continuous surrender. Most believers, he realized, prefer the illusion of spiritual control to the reality of spiritual power. What emerged from those prison years wasn't just personal transformation, but a complete re-understanding of how the kingdom of heaven operates on earth. Nee had discovered that divine power doesn't need to be begged for or earned. It simply needs space to manifest, space created by the removal of human interference rather than the addition of human effort. This space isn't created through external circumstances, but through internal positioning, a way of being that maintains constant availability to divine initiative while maintaining zero attachment to human agenda. The secret he had unlocked was simultaneously the simplest and most difficult spiritual truth imaginable, that God's power flows automatically to those who have learned to get out of its way completely, permanently, and joyfully. In his final written words, smuggled out of prison shortly before his death, Nee wrote that he had spent his entire ministry teaching people to do things for God, when the real secret was learning to allow God to do everything through completely surrendered human vessels. This wasn't passivity, but the highest form of spiritual activity, the activity of perfect receptivity to divine initiative, creating the conditions where heaven's power could flow into earth without obstruction or diminishment. Tonight, as you lie in the silence between sleeping and waking, remember that somewhere in a cold prison cell decades ago, a broken man discovered what emperors and religious leaders have spent centuries trying to hide from you. Watchman Nee's revelation wasn't just theological theory, it was the practical blueprint for accessing a dimension of spiritual power that transforms ordinary humans into extraordinary conduits of divine intervention. The secret he unlocked in those final years wasn't complicated doctrine, but the simplest truth imaginable, that God's unlimited power flows freely to those who have learned to get completely out of its way. Yet this simplicity is what makes it so terrifying to implement, because it requires the death of everything your ego has convinced you makes you valuable to heaven. The code Nee discovered operates right now, in this moment, as available to you as it was to him in that concrete cell. The same spiritual laws that governed his transformation are governing your life today, waiting for you to stop trying to be strong enough for God and start becoming empty enough for God. Every circumstance that has brought you to your knees, every failure that has shattered your self-reliance, every moment when your religious performance couldn't sustain you, these weren't obstacles to overcome but doorways to enter. The divine power you've been seeking through prayer and petition and spiritual effort has been seeking you through your weakness, your inadequacy, your absolute need for something beyond human capability. What separates the 1% who unlock this mystery from the 99% who remain trapped in spiritual mediocrity isn't superior faith or greater dedication. It's the willingness to embrace what Nee called the terrible privilege of spiritual bankruptcy. While others flee from their limitations, these rare souls learn to partner with God through their limitations. While others try to contribute something to their salvation and sanctification, these vessels learn to receive everything as pure grace. They discover that the cross isn't just something Christ did 2,000 years ago. It's the continuous spiritual position that allows heaven's power to flow through earthly vessels without obstruction. The question that will determine your spiritual destiny isn't whether you believe in God's power, but whether you're willing to stop interfering with it. Tonight, in the privacy of your own heart, you have the same choice that confronted Nee in that prison cell. The choice between maintaining the illusion of spiritual self-sufficiency or embracing the reality of divine dependence. This isn't a one-time decision, but a way of living, a continuous dying that allows continuous divine life to flow through you. The circumstances of your life right now, the very things you've been asking God to change, may be the precise laboratory He's prepared for your own discovery of this ancient secret. The prison guards thought they had silenced Watchman Nee when they locked him away from the world, but they had unknowingly created the conditions for him to access the loudest spiritual voice imaginable, the voice of God speaking through a completely surrendered human vessel. Your own prison, whether it's made of concrete walls or emotional barriers, financial limitations or physical weaknesses, relationship failures or ministry disappointments, may be the exact doorway through which you step into the same supernatural authority that transformed a broken man into an eternal voice for divine truth. The secret code isn't hidden in ancient texts or mystical practices. It's written in the spiritual DNA of your deepest surrender, waiting for you to stop running from your weakness and start running toward the God who makes His strength perfect in your acknowledged inadequacy. If this message has stirred something deep within your spirit, if you recognize the hunger for authentic spiritual power that religious performance could never satisfy, then you're ready to join a community of seekers who refuse to settle for spiritual mediocrity. Hit that like button, not just as approval, but as your declaration that you're done with powerless religion and ready for powerful relationship. Share this video with someone who needs to discover that their greatest weakness might be their greatest doorway to divine strength. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell, because we're going deeper into the hidden mysteries that the 1% have always known, but the religious establishment has systematically concealed. And in the comments below, tell us about the prison, whether literal or metaphorical, where God is currently preparing you for your own breakthrough into supernatural authority. Your story might be the key that unlocks someone else's spiritual destiny.